March 1943, aboard U-437 Mid-Atlantic. The Atlantic Ocean was not just a vast expanse of water, it was the hunting ground of the Grey Wolves, and Kapitänleutnant, Lieutenant Commander Klaus Dönitz, commander of U-437, was one of its kings. He was a veteran, a protege of Admiral Karl Dönitz, no relation but a shared philosophy, and a man who understood the sea in his bones. His U-boat, a sleek, black Type 7C, was a marvel of engineering. It was a predator, operating in wolf packs, cutting through Allied convoys like sharks through a school of fish. For 3 years, they had strangled Britain, sinking millions of tons of shipping, pushing the island nation to the brink of starvation. Klaus Dönitz stood in the cramped, dimly lit control room, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the diesel engines a comforting lullaby. Around him, his crew moved with practiced efficiency, a symphony of quiet commands and precise actions. These were professional killers hardened by years of brutal warfare. Hydrophone active Kapitänleutnant, reported Oberleutnant Senior Lieutenant Franz Müller, the executive officer. Multiple screw noises, convoy confirmed bearing 270. Dönitz nodded. This was what they lived for. The convoys were their prey, and the Allied escorts, the destroyers and frigates were merely obstacles, annoying obstacles but rarely lethal ones. Radio intercept, Kapitänleutnant, came the crisp voice of Lieutenant Werner Brandt, the radio officer. He handed Dönitz a coded message written on a small notepad. Dönitz took the paper, his eyes quickly scanning the familiar English phonetics. It was an intercepted message sent in a crude, easily broken code from one American destroyer to another. Another American convoy, Dönitz grunted, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Always the Americans, always so loud. He read the message aloud, a slight mocking smile on his lips. Contact bearing 090, looks like a straggler. Good hunting, boys, over and out. He scoffed. Good hunting, boys, over and out? They talk like cowboys on a range, not professional naval officers. No discipline, no proper codes. They might as well be shouting into a megaphone. Miller snickered. Indeed, Kapitänleutnant, the British at least maintain a certain decorum, but these Americans, they are so green. They send their ships alone. They send their boys to play at war. This was the prevailing view in the Kriegsmarine. The British Royal Navy was a worthy, if stubborn, foe. Their destroyer captains were seasoned, their tactics honed by centuries of naval warfare. But the Americans, the Yanks, they were the farm boys of the Atlantic. They had just entered the war. Their fleet was massive, yes, but untried. Their crews were young, fresh out of the heartland, just kids from Kansas who knew more about cornfields than sonar. The radio intercepts confirmed it. Their radio traffic was full of slang, informalities, and sometimes outright chatter. They often used easily breakable codes, or worse, no codes at all for non-critical messages. They are a simple people, Dönitz often told his crew, loud, unprofessional, easy to outsmart. This arrogant confidence was deeply ingrained. The U-boat wolfpack tactics, refined by Admiral Dönitz himself, relied on outmaneuvering, outwitting, and outkilling the escorts. The U-boat was the apex predator. The destroyer was merely a lumbering guard dog. Prepare for surface attack, Franz, Klaus Dönitz commanded, his smile widening. Let us show these cowboys how real sailors fight. 2 torpedoes, mark the lead merchant, and prepare for a quick dive. Their destroyers are too slow to react. This was how it had always been. The convoys were sheep, the U-boats were wolves, the escorts were merely inconvenient shepherds, easily bypassed, easily outsmarted. Dönitz had sunk dozens of ships. He was a hero of the Reich. His crew moved to their stations, the familiar sequence of commands echoing through the U-boat. Open outer doors, tube 1 ready, tube 2 ready. Then, as the U-boat slowly began its ascent to the surface, the hydrophones crackled again. Kapitänleutnant, Müller's voice was suddenly strained. New contact, very fast, bearing 090, closing rapidly. Dönitz frowned. A fast destroyer? Impossible. They are usually patrolling the flanks. Before he could give another order, the entire U-boat lurched violently. A sickening crump rattled the hull. Lights flickered. A distant metallic shriek echoed from the stern. Depth charges, Kapitänleutnant, Brandt screamed, his voice laced with panic. Multiple detonations, too close, too close. Dönitz grabbed the periscope, his heart pounding. He was not supposed to be detected this early. He was not supposed to be ambushed. He cursed. Dive, dive, emergency, dive. But it was too late. The second wave of depth charges detonated, closer this time, tearing at the U-boat's hull. Water began to pour in from a ruptured pipe. The U-437 groaned, shuddered, and began to sink rapidly, out of control. What in God's name was that? Dönitz yelled, trying to regain control of his vessel. They cannot be this fast, this aggressive. From the dark depths above, another, more devastating wave of explosions tore into the U-boat. A final, deafening crump ripped through the control room. The lights went out. The kings of the Atlantic were about to learn a terrible, horrifying lesson. The farm boys were no longer just talking on the radio, they were hunting, and they were using a whole new set of rules. April 1943, aboard the USS McDougal, DD-358, North Atlantic. The American destroyer, a four-stack relic built in the 1930s, was a rolling testament to the U.S. Navy's hurried entry into the war. It was slow, thirsty, and technologically lagging behind its British and German counterparts. Aboard her was Ensign Robert Bobby Calloway, 22 years old, from Topeka, Kansas. Bobby Calloway was indeed a farm boy. He had left his family's modest wheat farm just 2 years ago, trading the smell of dry earth for the perpetual scent of salt and diesel. He was green, overly enthusiastic, and terribly lonely. He had the unenviable job of radio communications officer. His captain, Lieutenant Commander James Grizz Grizzard, a career Navy man who looked perpetually stressed, had one rule. Silence is gold, Ensign. The air is black. You do not talk unless you are dying, and even then, make it quick. But for the young crew, silence was impossible. They were scared, bored, and isolated. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, was a terrifying place. They chattered, they cursed, they complained. They sent easily coded, or sometimes uncoded, messages about the weather, about their broken coffee machine, about the monotonous existence of convoy duty. "Grizz, sir," Bobby Calloway reported one blustery morning. "Another message from the USS O'Bannon. Ensign Miller says his depth charge rack jammed again. Coded. Rack is sick. Request aspirin. Over." Captain Grizzard rubbed his temples. "Aspirin. They're on an open frequency. These kids, they talk more than a flock of seagulls on a fish truck. Doesn't Miller know the Germans are listening to everything?" Yes, the Germans were listening, and they were laughing. Aboard U-401, Kapitän Lieutenant Heinrich von Wulfen, a decorated U-boat ace, meticulously read the intercepted traffic. He had code breakers who filtered the messages, but often the sheer lack of discipline made their job easy. "Listen to this, Herr Kallion," his radio officer chuckled, handing him a decoded message. "The American destroyer O'Bannon is requesting aspirin for its depth charge rack. They treat their weapons like sick children." Von Wulfen, a man who saw the American convoys as an endless supply chain of easy targets, smiled thinly. "They are children, Lieutenant. They are undisciplined. Their patrols are predictable. They fight with noise, not skill. They do not comprehend the seriousness of this war. They are just kids from Kansas." This arrogance defined the Wolfpack strategy. The U-boats believed the Americans were too inexperienced and technologically inferior to mount a serious threat. Their confidence was rooted in the knowledge that German technology, especially their directional listening equipment, hydrophone, and superior torpedoes, gave them a permanent edge. They were masters of the silent hunt. However, the reality in the U.S. Navy was changing faster than the Germans realized. While the crews were indeed young and green, the technology they carried was not. The slow, clunky destroyer McDougal had just been secretly refitted. A massive, complex antenna array was bolted high above the bridge. This was the High-Frequency Direction Finder, HFDF, nicknamed Huff Duff by the sailors. It was a revolutionary piece of British-developed technology designed to pinpoint the precise location of an enemy's radio transmission the instant it was sent. This was the ghost weapon. The Germans listened to the chatter of the Americans, secure in the knowledge that they only spoke in quick, untraceable bursts when surfacing to communicate with their wolf packs. But HFDF didn't need a long conversation. It didn't need a code to break. It only needed a millisecond of transmission. One afternoon, Bobby Calloway, frozen and bored, sat in the radio room. He wasn't listening to American chatter. He was listening to silence. Suddenly, a sharp, static-laced burst erupted on his console. A faint, rapid sequence of Morse code. A U-boat briefly surfacing hundreds of miles away to report its kill and position to Admiral Dunitz. It was the epitome of professional, concise German naval communication. "Contact!" Calloway yelled, adrenaline flooding his system. The light on the Huff Duff console flared bright red. The rotating antenna had caught the signal. The machine instantly calculated the bearing. 90 degrees. The U-boat was reporting its position, and Calloway, the green farm boy, had just caught the scent. "Captain to the bridge," Calloway screamed into the intercom. "We have a fix. U-boat transmission bearing 0900, 1 second duration." Captain Grizzard, hearing the non-code urgency in the ensign's voice, didn't hesitate. "All ahead full. Battle stations. Follow the bearing." The McDougal, slow as she was now hunting a ghost. They weren't reacting to a sinking. They were reacting to a whisper. Aboard U-401, von Wulfen was submerged, calmly moving in for another attack. He was secure. He had spoken for less than 3 seconds. No one could possibly know where he was. But a young ensign from Kansas who was supposed to be talking about a depth charge rack had just pinpointed his location with cold, brutal technology. The Americans were no longer fighting with discipline. They were fighting with mathematics. May 1943, Mid-Atlantic. The Black Hole. The Mid-Atlantic was aptly named the Black Hole by the Allied sailors. It was a vast, unforgiving expanse, too far for land-based aircraft from either North America or Britain to provide air cover. Here, convoys were utterly exposed. Here, the U-boats were truly kings. Kapitän Lieutenant Heinrich von Wulffen, commanding U-401, navigated this realm with an almost spiritual understanding. He despised the British, but respected their naval prowess. The Americans, however, were still a joke in his eyes. Their destroyers were loud, their tactics predictable, their radio chatter a constant source of amusement. But something had begun to shift in the last month. The amusement was starting to curdle into unease. U-437, Klaus Donitz's boat, was overdue, so was U-118 and U-501. One by one, boats were simply vanishing, swallowed by the cold Atlantic. Not in large, dramatic battles, but in chilling, silent disappearances. Radio intercept, Herr Kaleun, reported Lieutenant Brandt, Donitz's radio officer, who had survived the sinking of U-437 and was now assigned to U-401. He handed von Wulffen a new message. Another American message, Brandt said, a hint of frustration in his voice. They are still talking like children. This one from an escort carrier, USS Bogue. Captain says, "Saw a big fish, boys. Get your hooks ready. Over." Von Wulffen scoffed. A big fish? He talks as if this is a pleasure cruise. This Bogue, these escort carriers, they are toys. Small, slow, built on tanker hulls. They are pathetic targets, not a threat. He was not wrong. The escort carriers, CVEs, were indeed toys compared to the mighty fleet carriers. They were slow, lightly armed, and vulnerable. They were built on cheap civilian hulls, but they carried a deadly secret: aircraft. And those aircraft could fly in the black hole. This was a stupid American trick. The Germans had dismissed these small carriers as a joke, but these toy carriers carried a new type of hunter-killer, the Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber. Equipped with longer range, more sophisticated radar, and most importantly, magnetic anomaly detectors, MAD, these aircraft could smell a U-boat even when it was submerged. Back on the McDougal, Ensign Bobby Calloway, the farm boy from Kansas, was no longer just listening. He was hunting, and he was getting good at it. His HFDF had given the McDougal several fixes on U-boat transmissions in the past week, leading to frustrating near misses. "Ensign, your radio is giving me a headache," Captain Grizzard grumbled, peering at Calloway's charts. "Another U-boat bearing 080, 30 seconds of chatter." "Yes, sir," Calloway replied, his eyes alight with newfound purpose. "They're talking more, sir. They seem to be coordinating attacks. They think we can't find them." This was the irony. The more the U-boats relied on their Wolfpack tactics, the more they had to talk to each other. And every transmission, no matter how brief, was a ping on the HFDF screens of the farm boy crews. The Americans, these amateurs, were also developing a new, aggressive tactic: hunter-killer groups. An escort carrier bristling with radar-equipped aircraft would be paired with a squadron of destroyers. They were designed not just to defend convoys, but to actively hunt down U-boats in the black hole. In the depths of the Atlantic, von Wulffen was leading his Wolfpack. He had spotted a large convoy. He was coordinating his attack, surfacing briefly to send orders to U-505 and U-66. "A quick burst, Lieutenant Brandt," von Wulffen commanded. "Just enough to confirm the target. The Americans will not hear us. They are too far, too slow." Brandt, the veteran of U-437, felt a prickle of unease. He remembered the swift, devastating attack that had crippled Donitz's boat. The Americans were getting faster. The U-401 surfaced just for a moment in the pre-dawn gloom. A quick burst of radio chatter, then a fast dive. "Message sent, Herr Kaleun," Brandt reported. "No contacts, all clear." But it was not clear. High above, circling silently, was a TBF Avenger from the USS Bogue. It was not supposed to be there. This was the black hole. The Avenger's radar had picked up the U-boat's brief blip on the surface, and the MAD sensor sweeping the waves registered a faint but distinct disturbance in the Earth's magnetic field. A submerged U-boat. The Avenger swooped down, its engines roaring. It dropped a string of marker buoys, then its deadly cargo, a pattern of Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars. The Hedgehog was another stupid American trick. Unlike depth charges, which exploded randomly around a target, the Hedgehog fired 24 small bombs in a circular pattern, all designed to explode only on contact. This meant no missed explosions, no wasted effort, and no warning for the U-boat. Aboard U-401, von Wulffen heard the faint thump-thump-thump of the aircraft. He scoffed. A plane? So far out? Impossible. It's just a reconnaissance flight. But then the hydrophones picked up a new, terrifying sound. A cascade of splashes. Too many for a single depth charge. What is that? Von Wulfen yelled, his voice laced with sudden, chilling fear. What are they dropping? Before he could get an answer, the U-401 was rocked by a series of savage, bone-jarring explosions. Not from the outside, but from within the U-boat. The Hedgehog charges, detonating on contact, ripped through the thin hull like paper. Water poured in. Lights flickered and died. A horrible metallic shriek filled the U-boat. We're hit. We're sinking, Brant screamed, his face white with terror. The U-401 plunged into the icy blackness, out of control. Von Wulfen, coughing in the dark, knew. He knew what had happened. He had dismissed the toy carriers. He had dismissed the slow planes. He had dismissed the chattering destroyers. He had dismissed the farm boys. And now, those farm boys, armed with new terrifying technology, had found him in his own kingdom. June 1943. Naval Air Station Argentia, Newfoundland. The losses were catastrophic. In May 1943, the Black May, the U-boats suffered their worst month of the war, losing 41 boats. The kings of the Atlantic were being dethroned. The tables had turned, savagely and decisively. Kapitän Lieutenant Heinrich von Wulfen, commander of U-401, was one of the few who made it back to port. His damaged U-boat, barely limping across the Atlantic, arrived in Lorient, France, a ghost among the returning wolf packs. He had lost half his crew. His confidence was shattered. "What is happening, Admiral?" von Wulfen demanded, standing before Admiral Karl Dönitz in his bunker. "They are not fighting as before. They are finding us, everywhere, even in the black hole." Dönitz, a gaunt, furious figure, slammed his fist on a map of the Atlantic. "They have new radar, new sonar, new aircraft, and these cursed Huff-Duff receivers. Every time we speak, they know where we are." He was right. The HFDF, Huff-Duff, was proving to be a nightmare. Every brief radio transmission, every routine report from a U-boat became a death sentence. The American farm boys, with their crude radio chatter, were ironically using their own undisciplined habits to bait the German wolves, while their hidden technology listened for the real targets. But there was another secret weapon, one that the Germans still largely dismissed, even as it tore their boats apart: the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar. Back at Naval Air Station Argentia, Ensign Bobby Calloway, now a seasoned veteran of several convoy runs and near misses, was given a rare shore leave. He spent it at the base's small cinema watching a newsreel. It showed a newly developed anti-submarine weapon. The film showed a destroyer firing a volley of small, torpedo-like projectiles forward in a circular pattern before it reached the U-boat. Then a series of underwater explosions. "That's a Hedgehog," explained a grizzled chief petty officer who sat next to Calloway. "Ugly thing. Looks like a big porcupine, but it's a killer." Calloway had seen depth charges explode in massive, terrifying plumes of water, sometimes for hours, without results. The U-boat simply slipped away. But the Hedgehog was different. "It only explodes on contact," the chief explained. "So if you hear an explosion, you know you hit 'em. And if you hear nothing, you know you missed. No more wasting time just shaking the water." This was the stupid simplicity that bewildered the German naval mind. Their torpedoes were intricate, complex, precision instruments. Their technology was refined, elegant. The Hedgehog, developed by the British, was almost brutally primitive in its concept. It was a cluster of small, dumb bombs fired in a fixed pattern. It relied not on intelligent guidance, but on sheer, unthinking saturation. It was a weapon a farmer could understand. Just throw enough rocks at it until one hits. For the Germans, it seemed almost dishonorable. Admiral Dönitz, in his reports to Hitler, often dismissed these new Allied weapons as primitive tricks. He underestimated their effectiveness because they lacked the elegant complexity of German engineering. He underestimated them because they were, in his mind, farm boy weapons. But the farm boys were learning fast, and they were using these stupid weapons with terrifying efficiency. On a new deployment, Calloway was assigned to the USS Bronstein, a brand new destroyer escort, DE. This was another stupid American trick. The DEs were smaller, cheaper, and faster to build than full-size destroyers. They were built on civilian shipyards, sometimes even automobile assembly lines. The Germans dismissed them as tin cans and cheap imitations, but the DEs were designed for one purpose: U-boat hunting. They were bristling with sonar, Huff-Duff, and the dreaded Hedgehog, and their crews, mostly young men from the American heartland, were being trained relentlessly. 1 week into their patrol, the Bronstein was part of a hunter-killer group led by the escort carrier USS Core. Calloway, now serving as sonar operator, was glued to his screen. "Sonar contact, bearing 210, range 1,500 yards, submerged." HFDF confirms, came the report from the radio room. Faint burst, bearing 210, less than 2 seconds. The coordination was frighteningly precise. The U-boat had made a fatal error, a quick, desperate transmission to its wolf pack, and the farm boys, armed with their stupid technology, had instantly pinpointed it. Helm, steady course, all ahead flank. Captain Smith, the Braunstein's commander, barked. He was a quiet, unassuming man, not a decorated ace, but a meticulous hunter. Prepare to fire Hedgehog. The Braunstein plunged through the waves, a silent, deadly arrow aimed at the invisible enemy beneath. Calloway watched his sonar screen. The U-boat was trying to maneuver, to evade, but it was too late. The range was closing fast. Range 200 yards, target directly ahead. Fire, Hedgehog, fire! The deck of the Braunstein shuddered as the Hedgehog mortars launched forward, a terrifying cascade of small, dark projectiles arcing over the bow, splashing into the icy water directly over the U-boat's predicted position. Aboard U-66, Capitan Lieutenant Friedrich Markworth cursed. He had just sent a short, desperate message to his wolf pack, reporting the loss of U-401. He knew it was a risk, but he had to warn them. He had been detected. He could hear the screws of the American destroyer directly above him. "Depth charges!" Markworth screamed. "Prepare for depth charges!" He expected the familiar pattern, the distant thumps, the shaking hull, the slow, agonizing cat-and-mouse game. Instead, he heard a new, terrifying sound, a series of sharp, violent cracks. Not from the outside, but from within his U-boat. The Hedgehog charges, detonating simultaneously on contact with the hull, ripped the U-66 apart. Water poured in. Pipes burst. Men screamed. The U-boat groaned, lurched, and plummeted into the abyss, a final metallic shriek echoing in the dark. Up on the Braunstein, Calloway felt the deck vibrate, not from depth charges, but from the concussion of underwater explosions. Then a cheer erupted from the bridge. "Confirm hits, confirm sinking, no escape." Captain Smith, grim-faced, looked at Calloway. "Good work, Ensign. That's another one for the books." The farm boys were no longer just intercepting radio chatter. They were deciphering it, pinpointing it, and then, with their stupid but devastating weapons, sinking the kings of the Atlantic one by one. The war in the Atlantic was turning into a slaughter, and the U-boat aces had no idea what hit them. Late 1943, Naval Base Lorient occupied France. The mood in the U-boat pens of Lorient was no longer one of triumphant arrogance. It was a pervasive, suffocating dread. The victorious U-boat captains, once hailed as heroes of the Reich, now walked with haunted eyes, their faces etched with the cumulative trauma of seeing their comrades disappear, swallowed by an Atlantic that had suddenly turned hostile. Capitan Lieutenant Heinrich von Wulfen, commander of U-401, now reassigned to the new U-255, sat in a dimly lit tavern, nursing a schnapps. Around him, other U-boat veterans spoke in hushed, grim tones. They spoke not of kills, but of losses. U-66 is gone, one captain muttered, staring into his drink. No trace, just gone. U-401, Klaus Donitz's boat, another added, never made it back. The Americans, von Wulfen finally said, his voice flat. They are everywhere, they are relentless, they are different. The arrogance of kids from Kansas had vanished, replaced by a chilling realization. The Americans were no longer the unprofessional amateurs the Kriegsmarine had so readily dismissed. They were learning, and they were learning with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, faced the horrifying butcher's bill in his bunker. His charts, once filled with glowing red lines of Allied shipping losses, were now stained with the black marks of U-boat sinkings. In 1943 alone, Germany lost over 240 U-boats. The wolf packs were being decimated. Dönitz, a brilliant strategist, began to understand. He had underestimated the sheer industrial might of the United States. He had underestimated their capacity to innovate, to adapt, to produce new technology at an unprecedented pace. He received intelligence reports detailing the new American tactics and technology, HF-DF, Huff-Duff. The Americans were no longer just listening. They were pinpointing every U-boat transmission, no matter how brief. Every good hunting boys from an American destroyer, every target confirmed from a U-boat ace, became a beacon. Escort carriers. The toy carriers, once dismissed, were now the eyes and ears of the hunter-killer groups, closing the black hole of the mid-Atlantic. Hedgehog mortars. The primitive Hedgehog, ignored by German engineers as too simple, was ripping through U-boats with devastating precision, giving no warning. Centimetric radar. New, high-frequency radar, virtually invisible to German radar detectors, allowed Allied aircraft to spot U-boats on the surface at night, when the U-boats thought they were safe. Dönitz compiled a grim report for Hitler. He had to convey the unthinkable. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost. The Grey Wolves, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, were being slaughtered. Hitler in his Wolf's Lair bunker was furious. He refused to believe it. "The U-boats are invincible," he raged. "It is these incompetent commanders. They are cowards. The Americans are decadent shopkeepers. They cannot fight." But Donitz knew the truth. It wasn't incompetence or cowardice. It was a new kind of war, being fought by a new kind of enemy. November 1943, aboard the USS Braunstein, North Atlantic. Ensign Bobby Calloway from Topeka, Kansas, was no longer a farm boy. He was a U-boat hunter. He was still only 23 years old, but his eyes held the hardened gaze of a man who had seen death in the depths. He and his crew, a cross-section of young men from every corner of America, had become deadly professionals. The Braunstein was a well-oiled machine. They had refined their own tactics. Their communications, while still informal by rigid German standards, were now incredibly precise and efficient. They used HFDF to get the initial bearing. They used sonar to track the U-boat's every move, and they used the Hedgehog to deliver the killing blow. "Sonar contact, Captain," Calloway yelled from his station, his voice calm and steady. "Bearing 180, range 1,200 yards, submerged, definite U-boat." "HFDF confirms," came the report from the radio room. "Faint burst, bearing 180, very short. They're quick, but we got 'em." Captain Smith, the Braunstein's commander, nodded. "New U-boat, Type 9, fast and deep. They're still trying to outrun us. They're still underestimating us." This was the final, fatal mistake of the U-boat command. They still saw the Yanks as kids from Kansas. They still believed that their superior training, their professionalism, could overcome the sheer industrial and technological might combined with the relentless adaptive spirit of the Americans. The Braunstein closed in. The U-boat U-505 was now running silent, trying to evade. But Calloway, the farm boy, was an expert. He could hear the U-boat's faint propeller sounds, its internal creaks, the subtle shifts in the water, through the sonar. "Captain, he's deep," Calloway reported, "trying to run silent, but he's turning, bearing 200. "Helm, right full rudder, all ahead flank," Smith commanded. "Hedgehog crew, prepare to fire." The Braunstein rode the waves, a silent avenger. The U-boat, thinking it had slipped away, was now trapped. "Range 150 yards, target directly ahead, fire Hedgehog." A volley of Hedgehog mortars arced over the bow, splashing into the icy water. Then a series of muffled, terrifying cracks. Not one, not two, but a rapid succession of shattering explosions. The U-boat was being torn apart from within. On the sonar screen, Calloway watched as the U-boat's echo began to distort, to break apart. Then the signature of a sinking vessel. The ominous gurgling sound of water flooding a metal hull. The faint, high-pitched shriek of tortured steel. "U-boat sinking, Captain," Calloway reported, his voice devoid of emotion. "Confirmed. No survivors." Captain Smith nodded grimly. Another wolf pack, decimated. Another U-boat sent to the bottom. The kids from Kansas were no longer just intercepting radio traffic. They were deciphering the very patterns of the U-boat's desperate struggle. They had understood their enemy's fatal mistake, their arrogant underestimation of American ingenuity and perseverance. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest and most brutal campaign of World War II, was not won by brilliant individual acts of heroism. It was won by the relentless, coordinated, and technologically superior efforts of thousands of kids from Kansas who, against all odds, proved that the farm boys could indeed outhunt the Grey Wolves. March 1944, Admiral Karl Dunitz's headquarters, Germany. The reports were damning. The spring of 1944 brought no respite for the U-boats. The sinkings continued at an unsustainable rate. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the Wolfpack strategy, knew in his gut that the Battle of the Atlantic was lost. He had to face the horrifying truth. His elite force, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, had been utterly defeated by an enemy he had initially dismissed as amateurs. His intelligence officers presented charts filled with grim statistics. Allied shipping losses had plummeted, while U-boat losses had soared. They spoke of the relentless American hunter-killer groups built around the toy escort carriers and bristling with advanced technology. Dönitz, a man of ruthless logic, understood the core of their defeat. It wasn't just individual technologies, it was the synergy of those technologies combined with the sheer, overwhelming industrial output of the United States. "They build these escort destroyers in weeks, not months," Dönitz stated, slamming his fist on the table. "They build these toy carriers from tanker hulls, and they fill them with these farm boys who learn faster than our seasoned veterans." He had seen intercepted American radio traffic for years. At first, it had been a source of contempt. The casual chatter, the informal language, the occasional good hunting boys. He had seen it as a sign of weakness, of indiscipline. Now he realized his fatal error. That indiscipline was actually a sign of adaptability. These kids from Kansas weren't bound by generations of naval tradition. They were finding new ways to fight, new ways to communicate, and new ways to kill U-boats. The HFDF Huff Duff was his personal torment. Every time a U-boat surfaced to send a message, even a brief one, the Americans were waiting. The silent hunters were being hunted by their own voices. He also had new chilling reports from surviving U-boat crews. They spoke of invisible radar on Allied aircraft at night and of bombs that exploded inside the U-boat. The Hedgehog. These were weapons and tactics he had dismissed as crude or primitive. Now they were sinking his entire fleet. Dönitz ordered new tactics. U-boats were to remain submerged longer. They were to use new snorkel technology to run their diesel engines underwater. They were to avoid all radio communication unless absolutely critical. He was ordering his wolves to become silent ghosts. But it was too late. The kids from Kansas had already won the war. June 1944. Off the coast of Dakar, West Africa. Ensign Bobby Calloway, now a lieutenant junior grade, was serving on the USS Chatelaine, DE-104, another destroyer escort. He was part of a hunter-killer group led by the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal. Their mission was no longer just protecting convoys, it was to exterminate U-boats. Calloway, working the sonar and listening to the HFDF, was a master of his craft. He could differentiate between a whale, a school of fish, and a submerged U-boat. He could pick out the subtle, almost imperceptible nuances in radio chatter that hinted at an enemy's presence. On June 4, 1944, a new HFDF fix came in. A brief, very weak transmission. A U-boat far from its usual hunting grounds making a desperate call to a weather station. "Contact, Captain. Faint HFDF. Bearing 030. Very brief," Calloway reported, his voice tight with concentration. "It's a Type 9 D2, sir. U-505. They're trying to hide." Captain Gallery, commander of the Chatelaine, knew this was a big one. U-505 was a long-range U-boat, a valuable target. "All ships execute Plan Zebra, hunter-killer formation," Gallery barked into the radio. The Chatelaine and her sister D's, along with aircraft from the Guadalcanal, began a relentless, coordinated search. They used sonar, radar, and their human ears, trained by months of bitter experience. The U-505, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Harold Lang, was desperate. They had been discovered. They were deep, running silent, trying to evade the relentless American pursuit. Langa knew these Yanks now. They didn't give up. They didn't run out of fuel. They just kept coming. "They are too many," Lang muttered to his executive officer. "Too loud, too persistent. We cannot escape." The Chatelaine was now directly over the U-505. Calloway watched his sonar screen. The U-boat was trying to maneuver, to zigzag, but Calloway had seen every trick. He knew where it would go. "Captain, he's turning hard to port. He's trying to get behind us," Calloway yelled. "Helm, hard right rudder. Prepare Hedgehog." Captain Gallery responded instantly. The Chatelaine swung around, tracking the U-boat. The Hedgehog launched. A series of savage, bone-jarring explosions ripped through the water. On the sonar screen, Calloway saw the U-505's echo flicker. Something was wrong. Then a new, impossible sound came over the hydrophones. The unmistakable sound of a U-boat's engines running backwards. "Captain, he's backing down. He's trying to surface," Calloway yelled, his voice incredulous. It was an unprecedented act. U-boats never, ever surrendered. They fought to the last. They scuttled. They plunged to the bottom, but they never, ever surfaced in the face of an enemy destroyer. "He's been hit. He's surfacing," Gallery roared. "All hands, prepare to board. Get the boarding party ready." The U-505, crippled by the Hedgehog, blew its ballast tanks and slowly, agonizingly began to rise. It burst through the waves, a silent black leviathan, its conning tower riddled with holes. As it surfaced, Captain Lang, knowing his boat was lost, gave the order to scuttle. But it was too late. The kids from Kansas, led by Lieutenant J.G. Bobby Calloway, were already swarming over the sides. They boarded the U-boat, guns drawn, capturing the entire crew, including the mortally wounded Captain Lang, before the scuttling charges could detonate. It was the first time in history that a U.S. Navy ship had captured an enemy vessel on the high seas since the War of 1812, and it was a direct, brutal testament to the shift in the Battle of the Atlantic. The kings of the Atlantic, the U-boat aces who had dismissed the Americans as farm boys and children, had themselves become the hunted. Their arrogance, their fatal mistake of underestimation, had cost them the war. And the kids from Kansas, with their technology and their relentless spirit, had brought them to their knees. Post-war, 1945 onwards. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign in World War II, was finally won. The German U-boat threat, once an existential terror for Britain and a grave challenge for the United States, had been decisively crushed. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the Wolfpack strategy, would later admit that the U-boats were defeated by the enemy's radar, sonar, and air superiority. He conveniently omitted the farm boys who wielded them. The U-boat commanders who survived the war carried with them a profound, bitter lesson. Their initial arrogance, their dismissal of the American crews as unprofessional and naive, had been their fatal mistake. They had underestimated the sheer industrial might, the technological ingenuity, and the relentless, adaptive spirit of a nation they had once scorned as just kids from Kansas. Men like Kapitän Lieutenant Heinrich von Wulfen, if they survived, would spend the rest of their lives grappling with how their highly trained, elite force had been outmaneuvered and outfought by an enemy who seemed to defy all conventional naval wisdom. They had listened to the American radio traffic and they had deciphered it. But what they failed to decipher was the underlying strength of American unconventionality. The kids from Kansas and from every other state in the Union were indeed young. They were indeed less steeped in naval tradition than their British counterparts or their German foes. But they brought to the fight an unmatched enthusiasm, a willingness to embrace new technologies, and a sheer, bloody-minded tenacity that eventually wore down the Grey Wolves. The capture of U-505 by the USS Guadalcanal hunter-killer group on June 4, 1944, became a symbol of this shift. It proved that the Americans could not only sink U-boats, but could capture them, gather their secrets, and turn their own advanced technology against them. The captured Enigma machine and codebooks from U-505 provided invaluable intelligence to the Allies, further hastening the U-boat's defeat. Ensign Robert Bobby Calloway, the farm boy from Topeka, Kansas, would go on to have a distinguished but quiet career after the war. He was just one of hundreds of thousands of young Americans who left their farms, factories, and small towns to fight a war they barely understood, against an enemy who profoundly misunderstood them. He represented the true, unheralded strength of the American war effort: ingenuity, adaptability, and unwavering resolve. The legacy of the Battle of the Atlantic is not just about ships sunk or convoys saved. It's about a profound cultural and military clash. It's about how an elite, professional military force, blinded by its own sense of superiority, fatally underestimated an opponent who seemed, on the surface, to be nothing more than just kids from Kansas. These kids fought with their raw courage, yes, but they also fought with HFDF, Huff Duff, turning enemy radio chatter into deadly precise targeting. Escort carriers, closing the black hole with relentless air cover. Hedgehog mortars, delivering silent, devastating underwater blows. Centimetric radar, blinding the U-boats even at night. Sheer industrial might, producing ships, planes, and weapons faster than the Germans could sink them. The U-boat captains, who prided themselves on their professional discipline and their technological superiority, failed to grasp that the very amateurism they scorned was coupled with an unprecedented capacity for innovation and mass production. They interpreted informal radio chatter as a sign of weakness, when in fact it was often the sound of confidence, resilience, and adaptability. The farm boys won the war in the Atlantic not because they were smarter, but because they learned faster, adapted quicker, and outproduced their enemies with a relentless, pragmatic efficiency. Their triumph remains a powerful testament to the dangers of underestimating your opponent, especially when that opponent is just kids from Kansas. So, this brings us to a question for you. In history, what's another famous example where an elite or professional force fundamentally underestimated their opponent, only to suffer a shocking defeat? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one.